Sustainable minds, sustainable minds, sustainable minds with IPSF.
Hello, family. Welcome back to our World Earth Day podcast series, The Sustainable Minds of IPSF. We've been seeing some interesting infographics about real life stories of humanitarian crises caused by climate change or other environmental health issues, and how they can also pose a huge impact on the rights of further generations. So today, let's explore about this topic with Charlotta Benedek, who is the head of UNEP OCHA, or United Nations Environment Program Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Joint Environment Unit. Hi, Charlotta. We're so glad to have you here.
Hi, Irene. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for inviting my unit to participate in this podcast. It's very exciting to be here.
Yes, you're welcome. Yeah, so we hope that today's IPSF podcast can give our members a better understanding about environmental health and how it relates to human rights and vulnerable populations, and the importance of considering environmental aspect in our daily activities and health practices. So before we go further, Charlotta, can you please give us a brief introduction about yourself, your work, and how you became interested in your field?
Okay, thank you. So I've been working with the United Nations for more than 20 years, which is an indication of my age. I started very young, though, when I was back in 2000. I started working in Bangkok, actually, in Asia Pacific, and I was working with the Regional Commission. And then after a couple of years there, I moved to OCHA, which is the department in the United Nations Secretariat dealing with humanitarian response and the coordination of humanitarian response. So OCHA does a lot of things when it comes to disasters and crises. We work both in the conflict settings, and we also work to respond to natural disasters. So I've been doing a lot of things within OCHA. I've been working in logistics and preparedness and response, etc. And a couple of years ago, so back in 2 years ago, I moved to head up the Joint Environment Unit, which deals with two things. We deal with the immediate response to disasters. So we're right now, as we speak, sending a team over to St. Vincent, Grenadines and Barbados to deal with the aftermath of the volcano eruption. We were 3 weeks ago in Equatorial Guinea to deal with the dynamite explosion. You've all heard about the Beirut port explosion, etc., etc. So we really deal with the rapid response, sending experts to the field to really deal with the life-saving environmental concerns. Then we also deal in my unit with the sustainability. So we look at environment and humanitarian action. We look at things that we can do to make our response greener, to make it more sustainable. We'll come into this later, I think, when we talk about health and things in emergency settings. So things like clean energy, water and sanitation, things like that. And also looking at the effects of the climate emergency and the climate crisis, and how both we can build resilience in the communities and the areas where we work, and also how we, from our side, can make a contribution to make our response greener. So that's a little bit what we do. So on me more than that, I live in France, I work in Geneva, I'm Swedish, and yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for the interesting introduction. It's amazing, but I like to know, is there something specific, like perhaps an experience that motivates you to work in the area of environment/humanitarianism? Because I find it quite rare, and to reach the position that you are at right now, like how's the journey?
Well, every journey is personal. I think we end up where somehow we end up. Sometimes it can be very planned, or sometimes it just happens. I think my journey through the UN, well, I joined the UN because I wanted to work for something bigger than myself. Yeah. I have a master's in business, actually. So I have a business degree, which is not necessarily where you would think that someone with that degree would end up. But I was working in the private sector, and you know, as much as it is interesting, I really wanted to do something that was bigger than this. I wanted to wake up in the morning and think that even, you know, whatever I do, I was hoping that that would contribute to something else. And then within the UN, I think I've done so many different things within the UN. It is all very interesting wherever you work, I think. I think the humanitarian sector is really interesting because it's fast moving, it changes every day. You can plan your day, but you have no idea how your day is going to end up. And then the portfolio that I'm in now, I think it's just so fascinating, passionate, and important. I mean, the climate crisis is something that people have been talking about for years and years and years, but I think we are coming to a realization that now, if we do not do anything, it is going to just get so much worse.
Yeah.
We see it from our perspective. We see disasters that weren't supposed to be there. Like 2 years ago, the huge cyclone in Mozambique, they had never had a cyclone that side. It came at the wrong time. It wasn't supposed to be, you know. So we see things happening out of cycle. We see droughts where they're not supposed to be or have never been. Rainfalls are erratic, and then they become more and more and more frequent. They become more and more severe. So to be where I am right now is just an amazing place to be if you want to try from your corner to do something different and to try and influence what we're doing and how we can do it differently. And my little unit has an amazing place in that because we have the convening sort of mandate as OCHA. That's what we do. We try to coordinate. So we try to bring everyone in and have a common path and a common voice. So it's just just a very, very interesting place to be.
Wow, that's inspirational, very inspirational. And I hope that the audience of our podcast here, who are mainly youths, are also inspired by your story. And I agree. Maybe it starts from a simple motivation that we want to do something bigger. And then finally, we, like you, end up in this UN. I mean, like, it's a very big organization. And I hope that our members can also do the same thing. Like, when we have the will to change something, then we can, there is always a way. And I agree that, there are a lot of disasters that are happening out of sight. Like recently, because I live in Indonesia, there are a lot of disasters like floods and then earthquakes. And it's just so heartbreaking to see disasters coming one by one, and I don't know how they can just happen. A lot of them happen between 2020 and 2021, and I think that might be because of the environmental health issues happening. I think it's very important for us to start thinking about it, and further on we should do something about it.
Absolutely, you're right. And I also think, though, I must say that the youth and the youth movement when it comes to climate and the climate crisis is amazing. I mean, I think that's where the wake-up call has come, not necessarily from people in my generation, but I think that there is a huge push from the youth movement in this. And I think that is incredibly helpful. And I think the youth has a very powerful voice.
Wow, thank you so much, Charlotta. Okay, so now let's jump to the first question. What do you think is the link between environment or environmental health issues and humanitarianism?
The big question. I think there are obvious. There's both, from taking it from both sides. So if you have if you have a humanitarian situation, let's say we look at a big refugee camp, and then you look at what happens in these camps. You look at how people cook their food. You look at the fact that they're using coal that might not be the cleanest coal. They sit in their tents, the children are there, it's children and women mainly who cooks. And they're in their closed environment and breathing in things that is very unhealthy for them. So that's kind of the just one of the consequences of a refugee setting. You also have the consequences of flooding that threatens your sanitation, your lacking of clean drinking water, lack of adequate toilets, etc., with whatever that brings in terms of cholera and in terms of all kinds of waterborne diseases. So that's one of the things that we look at, right? So how, if we have an emergency, how do we make sure that we don't make it worse, right? Then you obviously have the other way around then. So how does a health issue create an environmental emergency, or how does that work? So if you look at an earthquake, there was in Indonesia, in your country, for example, where it turned out that some of the buildings that were erased or destroyed was containing asbestos. So that creates another huge health emergency. So they're kind of linked. I don't think that you necessarily have a health issue that then creates an emergency, unless you want to look at COVID, but that's maybe also, I mean, I don't know if it comes later, but COVID is obviously a health emergency, but it comes out of an environmental problem. COVID comes out of the fact that we have, through our lifestyles, encroached on the natural habitat of wild animals. That then created the perfect storm of, COVID jumping over to us. And I think this is a huge thing that we need to look at, is that the fact that we are destroying rainforests, destroying nature's natural habitat, it, unfortunately, I think people in my area don't see COVID as the last thing. This is not the last pandemic that we're going to see unless we do something differently. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it answers the question really. And wow, it's an insight for me. Like everything is just interlinked between each other. That environmental health issues can actually create COVID. And then like what you said in the refugee camps, the situation in there, it's a crisis. Yeah, like I've ever seen a YouTube video about Rohingya refugee camps. They're so densely populated, and they don't have good sanitation and hygiene. And I don't know how they're going to cope with the COVID-19, because we're supposed to like keep everything clean, and they also cannot do social distancing. So yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
And the Rohingya camp is also quite interesting, because so what they had done in the camp was to try and solve the energy issue. So they'd introduced a form of cooking using a gas that's called LPG. But the LPG created the fire that was just now, what is it, 2 weeks ago? I think there was a big fire in the Rohingya camp. So you solve one problem, but you bring another risk. So this is a constant dilemma for people working in those settings. How do we, Rohingya in Cox's Bazar, in the Rohingya camp, they're trying to work on nature-based solutions. So this is something that we try to work more and more with, making sure that, if you have a big camp and no cooking fuel, people will go out and cut down the forest, right? That's what they have to do. Now, cutting down the forest gives two issues. One is you're cutting down the forest, bringing more floods, and you lose that protected cover. Plus, you get, in some cases, into conflict with your host community, with the people who live there, because all of a sudden you're taking their resources. Yeah. So we also look at climate change or the environmental degradation as a driver of conflict. But then you solve that issue and bring them clean energy, and then you get the fire hazard. So yeah, it's very interesting, but so you have to kind of always look at it from various different problems, and then try and anticipate, if you choose one solution, what then might be the risks of that position.
I see.
Luckily, there are plenty of experts who are not me working on this. There's a lot of things going on, for example, in the energy sector right now, with looking at specifically these issues.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. Like it's very broad and very interlinked, and I hope that our audience here can also get interested to explore this area. Like I myself am so interested, honestly, after hearing your explanation. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Can the link between environment and humanitarianism is like vice versa? So can you provide us an overview of key environmental health infrastructure or aspects, and how can this be affected after a disaster and during a humanitarian crisis?
So I can give you just a thing that happened within the equatorial explosion. That was a couple of weeks ago, and there was this big dynamite explosion. So obviously that was, you have the immediate health infrastructure and health risks that happened. I mean, there was a big explosion, lots of ammunition, so that's one health hazard. Problem was that all the health facilities exploded at the same time, including the COVID testing centers. So all of a sudden there was nothing, so you have this first thing that happens that then ripples down. So not only could people not get treatment because for the immediate effects of the explosion, they also couldn't get the COVID testing. So then for us, then when we go in, we also need to make sure that that is solved. So luckily we work with a number of member states and a number of organizations. So we got assistance from a member state that brought in a military hospital so that we could set that up again. So you have that. Another health infrastructure risk that I see happening now with COVID is that we're so focused on COVID, but as a result, child vaccination in many of these countries have stopped or been halted. Yes. Or is not getting through in the way. So you actually see malaria and measles and all these kind of things which are preventable now shooting up again. So there, so it's all interlinked, because now we're all focused on COVID, which of course we should be. But then there are other things that are happening in the back end, sort of, or in other places.
I think that's also, as you mentioned earlier, like the youths are a kind of powerful movement. And that's also the whole purpose of our humanitarian team in the IPSF public health portfolio is it's to introduce our members that these problems do exist, like maybe in other parts of the world that they don't know, and then they can do something to help these crises. So it can stop somehow. The cycle can just stop. Maybe through simple activities like advocacy or social media movement or donation, or maybe they can directly involve themselves in the local communities, working on the field, being volunteers. Yeah, so I think it's very important for us to pay attention to these issues that we never know and try to help them as much as we can. Yeah.
Absolutely. And for you and your constituency working in pharmacy and pharmaceutical, I think you also have a potential of advocating. I am not going to sit here and be pro or against anything, but if you in your community see a vaccine that is not having a take up or something else that's related to your field, you can use your advocacy role and your voice within your communities, whether it is with your families, with your local communities, your friends, to actually amplify that message. Right? Yeah. So you do have that voice, and you're the experts on I'm not at all in pharmaceuticals, so I wouldn't know, and therefore I wouldn't also have, I don't think it's in my role to say, to have an opinion on it. But I do think that, in your field, the field that you feel that you're educated in, use that voice.
Yes, absolutely. Especially with the examples that you have mentioned earlier, that it's related to vaccines and measles and malaria, like all of those infectious diseases. I think that's what we all are learning in our college. So yeah, we can use
Yeah,
the knowledge that we have to help them. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So just now I mentioned about youths can work directly on the field as volunteers. So speaking about working on the field, I'm sure that our audience are also curious. Have you had any experience that you would like to share in solving or working humanitarian crises that are linked to environmental health issues? Can you tell us more about it?
So I mean, one example is the Indonesian earthquake, right? Where, as a secondary effect, there was an issue with asbestos. So what we do then, so I said at the beginning, like we will go in, we have a network of experts in their field. So, whether they're, we can look at dam stability, we look at hazardous waste, we look at medical waste, we look at all kinds of oil pollution. But let's go back, if you go back to the Indonesian one. So we go in, we do our first response, we actually see then that here's an issue. Here's a problem. There's asbestos, it's being, mashed, and then not necessarily everyone is aware. Right?
Yeah.
I actually wouldn't be aware. You can't see on your wall, is there
Yes.
asbestos in my wall? So people don't necessarily know. And asbestos is something that in many parts of the world is widely used because it's cheap and it's solid and it's great. And, I'm Swedish. It was only, maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago that we actually realized that asbestos isn't the best thing, especially not when you break it. So what we then do is we identify the issue and then we say, okay, what can we do now? There are a couple of things that we then try to do. Yes, you have the short-term response, you try and get the asbestos out. And then you have the longer thing. How do we make sure that when things are being rebuilt, that we don't use asbestos? Is there anywhere that we work with local government? Can we work with national government to say, how do we make sure, is it legislation? Is there, help that we can give for these communities that need to be rebuilt so that they can use another material than asbestos? So that's, for example, that's really something where we can see, we go in our short-term mandate, and then we see a longer-term issue, and then we can actually work, or we hand it over to colleagues. I mean, the UN is a big family. So the UNEP, the UN Environment Program, has a lot of experts working in precisely this. So then we hand that sort of portfolio over and say, here's a long-term issue. And then we work together with, with local communities, with national member states, with regional organizations, and we try and move a little bit further along, in the sort of to the end state where we would like to be, which is maybe asbestos in an earthquake-prone zone isn't the best building material. So let's look at what other options we have. And this can go in many other ways, right? When it comes to clean energy is something that we really look at. We look at not bringing in diesel generators into a humanitarian setting, for example, because they're not environmentally friendly. And we really look at clean cooking. We obviously have partner organizations looking at water and sanitation. So how do we make sure that when we go in, we have this thing called do no harm principle. So whatever we do, we should not hurt the environment where we go in. We should not hurt the affected population, and we should try and make it better. So that's really how we try to work in whatever issue or whatever situation that we're being faced with.
I see. Okay, and then my next question is, can you elaborate on how environmental health practices are central to disease and disaster management and humanitarian activities? I think you've mentioned a lot of them, but if you want to say something again, okay.
No, I mean, obviously, in any big emergency, and that's not my unit. In any big emergency, you have a whole sort of sanitation, water and sanitation thing coming in. We work, so in the UN, in the humanitarian system, we work according to clusters. So basically, we have decided, we've come together, all of us, and we decided that there is the water and sanitation clusters, one of the main ones. Then you have the shelter cluster, which will come in then and look at, people who have been displaced because of an earthquake, because of flooding, because of whatever. Where do they stay? How do we look at that? Then we have, we look at logistics. That's another big thing. How do we get all our supplies in? How do we get help in? How do we get, etc. So if you then look at the water and sanitation, that is led by UNICEF. So they have the experts. And in any big emergency, this is like the main thing that you want to look at, because we know that if you don't deal with your water and sanitation, you will have the issues of cholera, you will have all kinds of waterborne diseases, and you'll have a bigger health problem on your hands. So that's sort of when we go in and look at that. And then, as I said before, I mean, yes, then we will also come in with sort of the partners that we're working in on the energy issue, on, not looking at whatever is around. So we have this tool that we have developed that's called the NEAT tool, the Nexus Environment Assessment tool, which is basically on your phone. You go in and you look just, it's simple questions that you look at, and you go in and you say, okay, where is my energy coming from? Okay, that, I'm going to take it from the forest. Then that will being read on your phone and say, well, that is an environmental risk. So maybe you want to look at something else. So it's really, making it simple, just going through a checklist of seeing, what am I planning to do? What kind of risks does that have to the environment? And then as a follow-on effect to health, and then try and use other means. So, but it's really a whole of sort of response effort. It's not only my unit, it's not only my organization, it's really everyone else. We're looking at another health issue that is big for us now, is whatever we bring in, it comes in plastic. It's packaged in plastic. We all know that that's a huge health issue, right? Plastic ends up in landfills, it's being burned, it ends up in the ocean, we're breathing in. I mean, you don't even want to read about how much plastic you're drinking through your water or breathing in just by going out in the forest. So this is an issue, and the humanitarian system is moving tons and tons and tons every day. How do we deal with this? So again, it's not only us, but there's a huge community of everyone working in this, whether it's the World Food Programme, UNICEF, the Commission for Refugees. We're all coming together and say, okay, this is an issue. What do we do about this? How can we reduce the plastic that we're using? And how can we work with then our suppliers and our logistics to make sure that this doesn't happen, or that we reduce it in the future?
Okay, I see. Yeah, so this is like a joint working together. Everyone is involved. Yeah, so it's not only OCHA, it's also like the other organizations. Yeah,
absolutely. We're a big UN family, and not only the UN. I mean, there's huge non-governmental organizations. You have the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. There's a huge player in this, and we're all actually looking at this together, which is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, youth should also be a part of this movement, of course. Yeah. Okay, so my next question is, so do you think that COVID-19 has also exacerbated the situation in some vulnerable areas where environmental health issues are neglected?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's fair to say. I mean, we saw, I mean, just as an immediate impact, when COVID first came sort of last year, March, and everything was closed down. I mean, that was quite a serious lockdown. No one was going anywhere. There was a huge cyclone in the Pacific. We could not get there. No one could kind of get there. Luckily, they had quite a good system on the ground that they could respond themselves. But obviously, yes, there was an issue that nothing could get in and nothing could get out, right? And I think, as I said before, I think we have seen that some health related issues like normal vaccination programs, normal sort of programs that have been able to run or that was running before have had issues. There was an issue with flying. We use quite a lot of commercial aircraft to get our things in. Then what we did from the humanitarian system was then, not us, not my unit, but the global logistics cluster. What they have a fleet of their own planes that they were using, but also they were working together with partners to actually make sure that the humanitarian corridors were still able to operate. We had an oil spill off the coast of Mauritius last August, and the airspace was closed, so there were no flights going in. So then we did manage to actually charter a plane through our humanitarian partners and they flew our experts in. Socially, I think now we're getting into psychosocial issues and health issues. Yes, of course. You have a whole generation sitting inside and being locked up, and we can't go anywhere, and we can't see our loved ones, and we can't hug our, grandparents.
Yeah.
And those are consequences that we're all facing, and yeah, that we've hopefully we will not have to face for that much longer. But I think it's been a hugely hard year for everyone, wherever we are sitting and whatever we're doing, whatever field we're in, so yeah.
COVID-19, I think, has also shifted the focus, like what you said, from other issues like vaccination to children, and now everybody's focusing on COVID-19. Everybody's focusing on COVID-19. They're not focusing on humanitarian aid or crisis. Yeah, but still, we should not forget about that. And yeah, the power of local. So the local community should be the one who keeps moving and advocating about this issue. So we've talked a lot about environment and humanitarian crisis, and obviously we should prevent more environmental problems to protect the rights of future generations, just like what you mentioned earlier. So we come to my last question. What do you think should be considered in mitigating environmental health risk?
Whenever you make your decision, whatever that is, if you have the consequences of how your decision will influence that health risk, right? Even if you don't talk about humanitarian, you're buying a car, you're going to buy your first car or your second car, your third car. What are the implications of that car that you're going to buy? Are you going to buy an electric car or you're going to buy a diesel car? Well, then you're going to say, oh, well, obviously I'm going to buy the electric car, right? It's much better. Diesel is really bad. Which I would tend to personally agree with, right? But there are obviously issues with your electric car as well. Where does the battery come from? Who is making the battery? What is the environmental consequences of that battery being dug up from the grounds of whatever country the battery comes from, right? So, but I think that you can look at that. You can look at kind of those consequences. They can be either at your personal level, as I just said, or for us, they're at a more programmatic level. We're operating, Cox's Bazar or the Rohingya camp in Bangladesh. What are the health risks of whatever we're doing, and how can we look at mitigating those risks? Whether that is installation of proper sanitation, looking at the clean energy, installing solar power rather than diesel generators, looking at how we can work with nature rather than against nature, right? can we replant trees? Right? Can we make sure, and that's also an income generator for people in the camp. You can plant trees, right? And make sure that whatever you needed to cut down or whatever was damaged, that we build it back. So these are kind of the things that you at whatever level you're looking at, those are the kind of, it's when you have that in your mind, then you know what your risks are, and you know what your options are, and then sometimes you just need to find the money to do it. But there are also very cheap options, and there are actually really great options working with nature. And I think another thing that's really fascinating when you do that is when you work with the people who are actually working in that area or living in that area, who've lived there for years and generations. What is their knowledge? Their knowledge is normally amazing.
Yeah.
And there are solutions that if you're not from there, you wouldn't know. So I think, that's really fascinating when you go down and look at your local knowledge, wherever that is.
Yeah. So the point is to look at the consequences of our decisions, and also working together with the local community to work with nature, not against the nature. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much, Charlotta. We've come to the end of our podcast. Okay, it seems so fast. I really learned a lot from you, honestly, and thank you so much for sharing. Before we end our podcast, do you have any last words or messages that you want to share to our members?
Thank you for having me. I mean, I think it's always super interesting to talk to people who are working in different fields. We always learn things, and yeah, youth power is a big power. You have a lot of opportunities. I wish you all well, obviously, and good luck. But don't forget that you have that power, and use that power wherever you are.
Wow, thank you so much, Charlotta. Thank you so much for joining us in today's World Earth Day podcast series, Charlotta. I hope this podcast can give our members an insight on the relationship between environment and humanitarianism, and how we as youths can get involved, and that our power is so big, and that we should start from now on. There is no time to wait, especially with the COVID-19. It has already taught us a lot of things, so we should start from now to take care of our earth, take care of our nature, work with nature, not against our nature. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Sustainable mind.